How do you do? My name is Alfred Hitchcock, and I would like to tell you about our good friends, the birds.
That's the damnest thing I ever saw.
Birds just don't go around attacking people without no reason.
Yes, they attack the children. Attack them.
What's the matter with all the birds?
Birds are not aggressive creatures, miss. They bring beauty into the world.
Those gulls attack.
Impossible.
They came in right down the chimney.
All the windows are broken in Dan's bedroom. All the windows.
Why are they doing things?
It's the end of the world.
Are the birds gonna eat us, Mommy?
Get yourselves guns and wipe them off the face of the earth.
That would hardly be possible.
Mitch, don't!
The 5 continents of the world contain more than 100 billion birds.
All at once, the birds were everywhere.
Why don't you all go home? Lock your doors and windows.
Did you get the windows in the attic? When do you think they'll come?
What happens when you run out of wood?
I don't know.
You don't know. When will you know? When we're all dead.
After my father made Psycho, which is such a big success, he was, as usual, having his major trouble, which was looking for a story. Everybody expected so much, you know, and it was very hard to find stories, and he finally did find The Birds, which was from a short story by Daphne du Maurier, who wrote Rebecca, which was his first film in this country. And at the time, he wasn't sure if it would make a full-length movie.
We had just finished working on North by Northwest, and I saw Hitchcock on one of the sound stages. He stopped me and he said, I have a friend, Daphne du Maurier, who has written a short sort of novella. He said, would you read it and see if physically it creates too many problems? And I read it that night, and I was bowled over by its strength. But I saw it a little differently. I saw it as a mood piece, and I didn't see it as a narrative story. I spent the rest of the night and worked all night on it. And the image that came to me was Munch's Scream. I saw that as the kind of icon for the whole thing.
My father had initially purchased the rights to The Birds for his television series. After he read of real bird attacks taking place across the country, he felt the story had cinematic potential, and he brought in Evan Hunter to adapt the short story.
It was a sort of an apocalyptic short story, and it's about these birds inexplicably attacking this isolated little farmhouse in Cornwall. And I read it, and I would have given my right arm to work with Alfred Hitchcock. I then spoke to him on the phone, and he said, come on out with some ideas. He said, we're throwing away everything but the title and the notion of birds attacking human beings. He said, so come on out with some ideas. I remember Hitch showing me a lot of newspaper articles about unexplained bird attacks as a reminder that these things do happen, so we weren't dealing entirely with fantasy.
So then he said, well, what do you think, can we physically attack this project? And I said, well, the only thing is getting the birds into it. In those days, we were using blue screen for traveling matte backgrounds. And in those days, the blue screen very often had a rather disturbing fringing. And I knew that if we were to shoot these small birds with fast-moving wings, that it would be just a messy blur.
The blue screen process, while it had been essentially perfected in 1958, was still not quite to the level that Hitchcock wanted. And the best examples of traveling matte work in general that Hitchcock had seen was the sodium traveling matte shot process that was used primarily at the Disney studio. The sodium process was a method of combining foregrounds and backgrounds that were photographed at different times in an optical printer in post-production. At some point, you have to create a matte or a silhouette that enables you to distinguish photographically between the foreground, which is usually an actor against a screen, and the background. In the sodium process, the background was illuminated by yellow sodium light. Of course, the actors in the foreground were illuminated by white light. There were 2 films in a special camera, an old Technicolor camera. One film was sensitive only to the sodium light on the backing. The second film in the camera was sensitive only to the white light falling on the actors. So as a result, there was absolutely no contamination of the foreground actors by the lighting from the background. Typical of blue screen shots of the period was a sort of blue fire in hair and on the edges of objects. And the sodium light, because literally there was no light from the backing on the actors at any time, the sodium system could produce a higher quality composite that didn't exhibit the sort of blue flare and blue halos that were sometimes seen on blue screen composites of the day. Disney had brought the sodium process to a high level of perfection, and Ub Iwerks, who was the head of the Disney Special Processes Department, was hired as a consultant, and the Disney sodium equipment was used to create the traveling matte shots on the birds.
And it was a wonderful matting situation. It would even mat smoke. It's not used now because it was very cumbersome. Now remember, we're talking several years ago. Today, many of these problems would be solved with a computer.
Oh, I think that The Birds was one of the hardest pictures for him to make because it was so technical, and he had to be so prepared for it that literally, as we know, when he decided a movie, he would draw the whole movie. Well, it took him a long time to draw all of this.
Because of the difficult technical problems, we knew we were going to have continuity sketches. Well, Hitchcock loved to work that way anyway. His main thrust in all of his work was preparation. As a matter of fact, he sometimes facetiously said he was bored with shooting the picture. The excitement came with the ideas that were generated in the preparatory portion of the filmmaking process. He liked to have it all clear in his mind so that before he started to shoot, he saw the whole movie in his mind. There are very few people, directors or otherwise, that can hold this kind of a concept. Harold Michelson was the main production illustrator on The Birds. He did, I think, almost all of the illustrations.
I was given the script, and with Bob Boyle, who was the production designer, we would discuss the scene. And in fact, when they went up to Bodega Bay to shoot the whole company, I stayed at Universal. So in many cases, I was on my own in interpreting the script. And I did stuff for a few weeks, and then I got a call to come up there. And so they set me up there. So evidently, what I was doing was right. Hitchcock's method of shooting, moving in on a subject slowly, or objective, subjective way of shooting, which I hadn't heard before in doing, I, of course, went along with it, and I learned an awful lot about how to make a movie.
His working on The Birds, I mean, this was all done in pre-production, was worked out with Albert Whitlock, the mad artist, and a crew that went to San Francisco and sat in the dumps in San Francisco for months shooting birds, background birds. And so the technical aspects of The Birds was quite difficult.
I had been modeling in New York for a long time. It was about 11 years, and my career was sort of waning in that fashion business. I had done a number of commercials, and at one point I had about 12 of them going, and one of them ran on the Today Show every morning for about a month, and apparently a producer-director was watching the show and decided to find out who the girl was, where she was, and all of that. So I received a call on Friday the 13th of October of 1961. It was, "Are you the girl in the commercial, in the Seago commercial, the diet product?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Would you come over to Universal Studios?" I did, and I met with an executive there. I asked who is the director, and he wouldn't tell me. And then he asked if I would leave my photographs in commercial film over the weekend. So I said, "Well, yes, but I will have to pick them up on Monday." So Monday, I was introduced to a number of other executives. Nobody would tell me who it was, who the producer-director was. They just said, "Would you go over to MCA tomorrow morning and meet with Herman Citron, who was an agent there?" I went over and I met with Mr. Citron, and I sat down and he said, "I suppose you're a little bit curious as to who this director is." I said, "Yes." He said, Alfred Hitchcock wants to sign you to a contract if you will agree with the terms. And I was stunned. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry or run up and down the halls or what to do. And he said, if you are in agreement to this, we will go over to Paramount Studios and meet with him. So Herman Citron and I went over to meet with Hitch, and we didn't talk about anything other than, we talked about food, we talked about travel, we talked about wines. We didn't mention movies at all. Not at all. I heard that they were doing The Birds, that Evan Hunter was working on the script, and Hitch was working with him on it. And, I thought, well, that's very interesting, it's very exciting and all that, but it never occurred to me that I would be involved in this movie at all. I thought I would do the television shows, which, he did every week. They talked about doing a screen test, and they chose 3 different roles for me to play in the screen test. One from Rebecca, one from Notorious, and one from Catch a Thief. Now, these are 3 entirely different women. And Hitch was my drama coach. And I would go over to the Hitchcock home where Alma and Hitch would both go over the scenes with me, which was fantastic. Alma had a great deal to do with a lot of his work. So we eventually did the screen test. It took 3 days. And Robert Burks was the DP on it. And Edith Head, of course, did all of the designs of the clothes. And she did a personal wardrobe for me. It was an extraordinary time.
Remind me to tell you a story about donuts and their manufacture, will you?
Oh, I've heard that. It's a terrible story. In order to do the screen test, we, of course, needed a leading man. And Hitch flew Martin Balsam out from New York to be my leading man, because he had just come out of Psycho.
Tell me, Mr. Balsam, what exactly do you have in mind?
The screen test was put together, and I guess everybody saw it. And Mr. and Mrs. Hitchcock invited me to dinner at Chasen's. Lou Wasserman was sitting to my left, and Alma and Hitch were to my right. And Hitch placed a very, very beautifully wrapped package from Gump's in San Francisco. It was one of his favorite shops. And I opened the box, and there was this beautiful pin of 3 birds in flight with the seed pearls and gold. And I looked over at Hitch, and he said, "We want you to play Melanie in the Birds."
Visita mi canal.
Well, I started to cry. I mean, these big tears were welled up because I didn't expect that. I really didn't expect that. And I looked at Hitch, and he was a little watery, and Alma, and even Lou Wasserman, this big movie mogul. I mean, he had one little tear coming down here. It was a very exciting evening. It was just incredible. And then, then the whole, all of the work really began.
I got this call out of the blue from Mr. Hitchcock, and was totally amazed, And I came out, and being a brash young brat, I guess I didn't show any kind of respect that I was supposed to show, and I think he kind of liked it. And we got on extremely well. And I did, of course, the wrong thing. I called him Alfred. I didn't say all the right things. I remember that. I said, I hope the birds and things don't kind of totally outshadow the people. Well, of course, that's the story. They're supposed to, So that was number 1. Wrong. But then we really talked about making movies and how I loved it and how I was interested in his work. I brought that up and said the right thing. And we just got on extremely well. And that was it. We didn't get into any deep discussions about the movie itself at all. No, what do you think of the character? No, none of that. It was taken for granted that I loved it and wanted to work with him. And I was absolutely flattered and astonished that he wouldn't mind working with the kid then.
He hated location, just hated it. He says you don't get the right lights, you've got the noise, and you have to then come in and redub. If ever he could get away without location, he would.
As a matter of fact, when Tippi crosses the street and goes by a sign, she goes behind it, which we used as a patch match, and then we picked up the rest of the thing in the studio.
Mr. Hitchcock saw Tippi in a commercial where someone whistled at her and she looked back, and there was something about that moment when she did that caught his attention, and he loved to put in little subtle jokes. There is a scene where she's whistled at and she does turn a lot like that commercial. Those dogs that were in his cameo in The Birds, those dogs ate better than most people in the world. I mean, he would go to the store and get the finest cut of meat and have them grounded up for these dogs. They were wonderful. He would bring them to work. They would be in his office, and he loved them dearly.
I wonder if you could help me.
What?
I said, I wonder if you could help me.
Yes, what is it you're looking for, sir?
We were just trying to find a hook, a way to get into the movie. And on the lunch hour, while I was walking around, I came up with the notion of a screwball comedy, doing a couple who meet cute and go from there into comedy until it turns to terror. And I told him this after lunch that day, and he said, yeah, that sounds interesting. So then we tried to find characters who would be mismatched, who would strike sparks, and we hoped comic sparks. And it seemed to me that a society woman, first of all, in the old screwball comedies of the 40s was your mainstay. You know, she always was a madcap society woman. And a lawyer is the very notion of solidity and stolidity.
There we are.
Oh, there.
Wonderful.
So it seemed that a lawyer would be a good type also.
Back in your gilded cage, Melanie Daniels.
What did you say?
We didn't actually do any pre-rehearsals.
How did you know my name?
A little birdie told me.
I didn't meet Rod Taylor till we were really ready to film.
I just thought you might like to know what it's like to be on the other end of a gag. What do you think of that?
I think you're a louse.
I am.
Immediately we became the best of friends, Tippi, Hedren, and I, and still are the best of friends. And so it was very easy. If there was, we rehearsed together on our own, and it was extremely easy because we had a lovely chemistry without trying for it.
Hitch was not only my director, he was my drama coach, which was fantastic. I mean, you couldn't have had a better teacher. He not only helped me with developing the character of Melanie Daniels, he had me sit in on meetings with Evan Hunter, with Robert Burks, the DP, with Bobby Boyle, the set director, with, and of course Edith Head, who I worked very closely with on designing not only the clothes for the Birds and Marnie, but my own private wardrobe. But in every phase of making that motion picture, he was sure that I was educated in it.
Miss, is that for Mitch Brenner?
Yes.
He's not home.
Oh, that's all right.
He won't.
And it was stunning. It was an amazing education that I received.
Yes. I don't think you should leave them in the hall, do you?
Well, where did he go?
Bodega Bay. He goes there every weekend.
Bodega Bay. Where's that?
Up the coast about 60 miles north of here.
And I think Northern California always reminded Hitch of England. There was something about the weather which was very unpredictable. It was fog and rain and then sunshine and then fog and rain again. It was a moody, strange area, both forbidding and foreboding. And I believe that's what intrigued him. It had a kind of mystical quality.
With the Birds, he shot the first part of it was actually up in Bodega Bay on location, and then the rest of it was shot here at Universal.
We had to get all of these various pieces and put them together to make one small community out of it. We built a school teacher's house in Bodega, which was a few miles from Bodega Bay. But Bodega Bay
Visita mi
was
canal.
perfect. It was almost completely enclosed bay, and there was what is called Bodega Head, which is where the house was. There was an old house that had gone to rack and ruin, so we could only use the sort of almost the foundation. We rebuilt the house, and we added a barn, and that could be reached by road and by boat, which suited the purpose of the film perfectly.
Albert Whitlock is, with Peter Ellenshaw, probably the foremost matte artist of the sort of middle generation of film. It's the matte artist's job, traditionally, to extend existing settings with painting.
One of the stories that Al related to me was when he showed a test of one of his background paintings of Bodega Bay to Hitchcock. And it was a beautiful scene of Bodega Bay in the background. Hitch thought it looked very beautiful. Without Al being there, he showed it to Peggy Robertson, his assistant. And he said, "What do you think?" And she said, "Oh, it looks like a painting." And Hitch stiffened and thought, "Oh." Then he said, "Well, you know, of course, it's real." And she said, "Oh, I know it's real, but it's so beautiful it could be a painting." And so it was a compliment to Al's extraordinary painting skills that it fooled everybody, but it was still bigger than life.
We would run in the projection room silent movies, quite a few of the classic silent movies. And Mr. Hitchcock, he always told me that if you could follow a movie without any words and you knew what was happening and you got the emotion and the feeling and the suspense, you're making a great movie. So a couple of times we wouldn't run sound on sound movies, and then he'd bring out where the audience would be lost or where he felt something should have happened there to tell the audience what was happening. And in Hitchcock films, he took the audience down this road with the camera. The dialogue was there, but you followed that camera, and that was his great, I think, genius of making suspense movies.
We searched for the turning point where it would get ominous. You know, we recognized immediately that the audience wasn't going to sit there for 2 hours waiting for a bird attack. So we very carefully measured out the lengths between the bird attacks so that the audience would sit there and we'd throw them a crumb, so to speak. So the first one was when the gull hits Melanie in the rowboat.
Hitch always felt that it was very important for close-ups to be done under controlled lighting. And he wanted almost all of the close-ups to be done at the studio, which was Universal. So they had this elaborate setup. Up in the rafters, they had a wire that went from the rafters down to, you know, almost to right over my head. And then they had a fake seagull, which was on top of the rafters. Now, okay. So then we have a prop man, and he has a tube and a plunger, and attached to that was the fake blood. So they put the tube up through my hair, and then Virginia Darcy, my hairdresser, did the French roll and the whole thing, and she hairsprayed my hair. It was almost like a wig. I mean, a real solid helmet, except for one little lock of hair that was loose. They let the bird go down the wire, and Bobby Boone, who was the prop man, had the plunger ready, and he watched the bird coming down, and when it got to the right place, he did the plunger, and the bird went over, and the hair goes forward with the blast of air. It was incredible. Absolutely incredible.
That's the damnedest thing I ever saw. I don't know, it seemed to swoop down at you deliberately. Oh, you're bleeding, too. Let's take care of that.
It's a movie about the dangers of complacency, I think is what he said. We all take things for granted, and we take birds for granted. What if they suddenly turned, you know? This is what would happen. That's a theme that runs through a lot of Hitchcock's pictures. That people take things for granted, people go through their life unthinkingly, and then something happens, and then they have to think.
The birds represent the eruption of chaos, of unpredictability, and which can be taken to be everything that we don't understand and can't control about our world. Not only the physical world, but also the world inside us. Underneath all the protective coverings that we use to get through life, and which at the same time seal us off from other people. What would have happened if the seagull had not attacked Melanie at that moment? It seems very unlikely at that point that her relationship with Mitch would have developed beyond what it is. A sort of mutual hostility, mutual provocation all the time.
Ow.
Each of them wants to provoke the other.
What are you doing up here?
Didn't you see the lovebirds?
Oh, you mean you came all this way to bring me those birds?
It's the bird that destroys all that, the gull attack. And that happens progressively all the way through the film.
Mother, I'd like you to meet Melanie Daniels. Miss Daniels, my mother.
How do you do? How'd you do, Miss Daniels?
My father cast a wonderful person like Jessica Tandy, who was one of his favorite actresses, and he had, of course, used her husband, Hugh Cronin, in many of his movies.
Working with Jessica Tandy was just celestial. I mean, a consummate actress. You know, just watching her working was just thrilling. Absolutely thrilling. And what a beautiful person she was. Not just physically, but just, you know, really considerate and fun.
Jessica Tandy was magnificent. She was such a lovely, lovely woman. Jessica and I got on beautifully. She was the ultimate wonderful pro. And so gentle and sweet and wonderful and very, very talented.
Hi.
Hi! Miss Daniels?
Yes?
Oh, they're beautiful. They're just what I wanted.
I had actually done a couple of those Alfred Hitchcock shows, his weekly series, but I had never met the man. And he had seen me, I believe, in the Children's Hour. So he requested meeting me, so I went over. And I must have been in his office for at least an hour. He found out that I was born in Bristol, England, and he goes, oh, yes, well, that's where the best wine cellars are. So he proceeded to tell me the best wines to buy and what the best wine cellar was in a distributor and all of this. And he told me how to cook a steak. And he said you have to pull it out before it is fully cooked because it will continue to cook. These things, of course, I have applied in later years, but at the time I was 11, or 12. So I had no idea. I thought, what odd conversation. But he was very nice to me. He was great.
Miss Hayworth?
Yes.
I'm Melanie Daniels. I'm sorry to bother you, but...
Yes?
One of the ideas I brought to Hitch was a school teacher coming to a town, and bird attacks start when she comes to the town to teach there. And the provincials think she must have something to do with it. There's an echo of that in the scene in the Tides restaurant for the mother. You're responsible for this, you know. They tell me this didn't happen before you got here. And the school teacher survived as Annie Hayworth.
Did you want to see Kathy about something?
Well, not exactly.
Oh. Are you a friend of Mitch's?
Suzanne, she decided that, I don't know whether it's because she wanted to play Tippi's part or not, because her character was always sort of that little bit of jealousy that went on because she was in love with Mitch. So she borrowed a blonde wig, and she came out with a blonde wig on, and she says, well, can't I do the role? I mean, she came out and she played the whole day like this with this blonde wig on. She was very fun. She was a good spirit and a good sense of gung-ho. She's very funny. I had, which I hadn't expected, it was a surprise birthday party. I had my 13th birthday while doing the birds. All of a sudden, here was this enormous cake, and everybody sang, and the whole crew stopped, and Jessica gave me a wonderful sweater, which I still have someplace, and Tippi gave me lovebirds. And Hitchcock took out a piece of board and a crayon and wrote, to the woman I love, Veronica. And then he proceeded to draw his face and signed his name on it. And he handed that to me. I mean, that's great. And I still have it, and I had it framed, and so that was my present from him.
Look! Look! Hey! No touching allowed!
I think that was one of the most fascinating movies to go on the set because they had fake birds, they had real birds, they had trained birds.
The funniest people on the thing were the bird wranglers, because they were bad-tempered. And they were great guys, and I'd have drinks with them in the evening, but you look after a bunch of seagulls and ravens and crows and pigeons and God knows what else, and you get very nervous, you know. But Ray Berwick, he was the head bird wrangler, and he was a wonderful guy. And he indeed had patience. He wasn't as bad-tempered as his buddies. He knew his birds backwards. He was like a great old cowboy with horses, you know. He knew these silly-looking birds, and he understood them, and he liked them.
Working with the birds was very interesting. I love all animals, I always have. And it was very exciting for me to work with the birds. And Ray Berwick, who was the bird trainer, he taught flocks of birds. He taught them 6 at a time. He taught them individually. The ones that were taught individually basically could never be released because they were taught to do very bad things. You know, like they'd be taught to dive bomb somebody or you know, peck them or, you know, really go after people.
All these tricks were pretty horrifying and pretty exasperating. That's why these wranglers just were going through hell as well as us. We all had our trips to the nurse's station here on the lot to get our tetanus shot, you know.
Help me get the children into the house.
With all these bird attacks, no computer tricks, nothing like that. These kids, they'd tie the birds to the back of their collars, and they'd be flapping and carrying on, and it was quite terrifying, really. But how else could you do it? And then there was no CGI with birds coming into the lens. You put meat in the lens.
We realized that if we were working with seagulls, we could train them to go for food. They're greedy animals, and so you could put a food just behind the camera or right on top of the camera, and they'd fly into the lens.
My mother and I were visiting them up in Bodega Bay when they were shooting the children's birthday party, and there was a trained gull called Charlie who they would wire their beaks so that they, you know, wouldn't hurt anybody.
He was on long wires, and his beak had been bound with some sort of tape, and his claws, so that if he actually did hit me or anything, because I think I had seed in my hair so that he would dive down to me, then he wouldn't hurt. But the string broke, and he started going out to the bay.
There were very low tides at Bodega Bay, and these sand flats stretched for miles. And it was nothing to see one of these poor wranglers running after a seagull that was flopping along just 6 feet ahead of him for miles.
And they couldn't get Charlie back in again. And poor Charlie with the beak, you know, wired up. They thought, oh, what with this poor thing, what's going to happen? But they did. He did come in.
What we also had to be always concerned about was the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals.
The SPCA was on the set a lot, and the script girl actually started to be a great protector of these birds, and they actually built an aviary onto the set for birds that had been hurt or injured, and she would take care of them.
Just listen to those lovebirds.
When they did the scene where all the birds come down the chimney, they had to net the whole set.
The inside of the house was inside yet another canvas house, so that when all these damn birds got out, which they would, of course, the poor wranglers could catch them.
And then the camera would poke through a hole, and they had crates in the back of the chimney with these, like, pull-out things. And then they would pull them out, and the birds would swoop down.
You know, we didn't really rehearse this. It was just, you know, because using the live animals that we wanted to take it right away. So everything was lined up, and Ray took the little box of strawberry finches and let them go down the chimney. And we thought they'd be flying around, and, well, they sat on the hearth. And a few of them jumped up on the coffee table and on the arms of the chairs, and they weren't doing anything. We were going, okay, what do we do now? So we thought about it and all the different things that we could do. Maybe using a fan would be good. you know, and then they'd fly around. Well, so would our hair. You know, so that wasn't going to work, and our clothes would fly and everything. So we finally decided that we would do the scene without the birds. So all of us are reacting to birds that aren't there. And then the film, once it was edited, was sent over to Disney.
That's where the sodium came in, because we could have traveling mats of these sparrows, linnets, small birds. They were shot against sodium to print into the final take.
Cover your faces! Cover your eyes!
I must say we tried to use mechanical birds, and we did use a few, but mechanical birds that moved didn't work out too well. So we finally decided to work with crows. The reason we started with crows is obviously they had an intelligence that most birds don't have. You could train a crow, but because they were so intelligent, they were also hard to capture. But Ray Berwick, I think Ray had done Birdman of Alcatraz, which was only a couple of birds. And here we were dealing with thousands. So we finally had to go with eggs, growing crows. Now that didn't take as long as it sounds because they were very young. I think there's still some of the original crows flying around here. They live a long time.
Ray Berwick, who was the main handler, he had a crow, or a raven, I believe he was, named Buddy. And Buddy was trained, and so he was sort of like the leader.
tus
He could
trailers.
tell
Visita
him
mi
when to
canal.
pick your hand and do things like that.
There was one named Buddy, very beautiful raven, who I became friends with.